newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known. For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. They wallow in corruption, crime and gore. Ting-a-ling-ling, city desk, pull the press, extra, extra, read all about it, it's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the press.
The Media Project is a half hour of commentary and analysis on what's going on in the media around the country with the voices of some of your local journalists offering insights, we hope, at least commentary. I'm Rex Smith, former editor of the Daily Gazette. I'm Rex Smith, former editor of the Times-Union, now with the Upstate American, and I want to introduce you to my colleagues here in the room. Of course, right over here to my right is our producer of this program, the morning host of WAMC, who occasionally stops by the studio for these tapings, Mr. David Castina.
Let's leave insight out of this.
We will. David's also an adjunct professor of journalism at UAlbany, so genuine certified expert. Next to him is the editor of the Daily Gazette, Miles Reed. Miles, how you doing?
Very good. Good to be here.
Well, glad you're here. Miles is sort of sitting in for his predecessor, Judy Patrick. And here next to me is J.P. Miller of the Empire Report, the foremost news aggregator in New York State. J.P., glad to have you here.
Rex, thank you for having me.
I think your role is owner, player, manager, coach, right? Yeah.
Yes, I don't really have a title.
That's
no one's ever given me a title, so that's kind of what I get.
Yeah. So David put before us a very interesting piece here in which two of our leading publications, I think the New York Times and the Washington Post, have had some commentary about Vice President Kamala Harris's attire. Now, the question is, with the headline, Kamala Harris is dressing to be president. The vice president is sticking to her suits, a political move of its own. Is this fair to take a shot at?
So, Rex, I think this is one of those things that, at least from all the letters that we've received at the Gazette, it's sort of been a mixed bag. I think some people have said to us they think it's a legitimate thing that people talked about, President Biden's outfit, his sunglasses, his look. People talk about former President Trump's look, about his weight, about that he always wears the big red tie, so that it is fair. But we certainly have had plenty of people who said she's a woman and they're going after her because of it and they're treating her differently. So we're not really sure about it. One thing we do know is it's generated a lot of interest.
I'm a little leery being on an all-male panel to be talking about this topic, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. I think if you ask whether it's newsworthy, people are interested in how politicians and celebrities dress. Male politicians typically, unless you're Senator John Fetterman, who wears a hoodie, male politicians typically wear a blue suit and tie and, look relatively conservative. It is a tough thing to do to write about that. I haven't read any stories about Vice President Harris and her dress, but I think it's relatively fair game as long as you're not being critical. I would assume it would all be complimentary, right?
Analytical. By the way, JP brought up something, David. We kind of look like Mount Rushmore here, these four guys.
Yeah, and that's on me, Rex. I'm the producer of this program. You want to know what my main job is? Get people in here to record the program. And it's not as easy as you would think. Many local journalists who are working, they want to operate on the objective criteria, and they don't want to make statements about news or talk about that. And our regular female panelists, Judy and Barbara, apparently have been planning vacations together because they are out of the area right now. And we are making efforts constantly. I have a couple of people in mind right now I'd like to see coming onto the program. Stay tuned.
Okay.
We'd like to get more people in here for that reason. And if you would let me just go a little further and comment on this particular story. I think it is, in many ways, a sign that we see women more as objects than we do men. Putting aside for a moment, Miles, what the readers of the Gazette have said, and I think they're valid points, the sunglasses, and even JP commented about, basically suits with ties, and there's some comment on that every once in a while, but that's usually within an article. It's not a full-on New York Times look at how she dresses as a woman. I don't think we see profiles
A whole piece about Donald Trump's red tie? No, that hangs down to his...
Yeah. Now, the point being that I don't care if they put it in the style section, it's still in some ways, in my mind, sexist in that we treat women as objects of beauty, something to look at, and we're going to look at them critically under that eye, and they're fostering that on some level. I do, however, take the point that we do, in general, as human beings, look at people and make judgments, and that there may be, in some respects, a little bit of a double standard when it comes to women and how they, for example, even make it on the air in television news.
Well, that's an interesting point that we've talked about here, of course, over the years, because it's been a phenomenon for some time. By the way, listeners, if you have thoughts about this, if you'd like to agree with David or with Miles or JP or me or otherwise, media@wamc.org is our email address, and we're very happy to have you do that. What about the fact that, it's hard to get people to pay attention to policy issues when you think, well, that's really what we ought to be talking about? I mean, what are the candidates going to be doing about the economy, about immigration, about our America's role in the world? Or are they going to be abrogating our traditional leadership position there? And against that backdrop, a journalist, I think, if you're an executive producer or an editor, if you're making decisions about what you're going to do, you have to consider this. Let me give you a little statistic. In a survey via Newark University Chicago, the question, I'm tired of receiving and processing news about the 2024 presidential election. What did people say about that? 48.8%, about half, said they agreed or strongly agreed. They're tired of news about the election. Only 22% disagreed. And so if you have half of the people already tired of news, what are you going to do to get them interested? Do you every now and then give them something of interest that isn't perhaps as substantive?
I know at the Gazette we try to, take that front page, and we still think in terms of there's our print and there's our website. In terms of the front page, we try to give them something every day that is either a good news story or an unusual, quirky story. We try to balance it. It doesn't mean we're not dealing with the news of the day. When Walz is tapped, we're going to put that on the front page. But we fight this, battle saying we want to try every day to have something in the paper that's sort of a different slice of life or a nugget, because we know there's massive fatigue in terms of news consumption. I hear it every day at my home, people saying, I can't even look at the paper, I don't want to look at it. But we do know people are still reading because we get flooded by letters to the editor. And so we try to intersperse the news with something interesting. Rex, I can't remember your phrase, but a golly Martha.
There you go.
A golly Martha. We don't have that word in our paper, but we look for those too, and we try to get them out as much as we can. And when we discover them out in nature, we jump on them, try to get photographs, and develop a story.
I have to say that it's quaint that you worry about the front page, because that shows you're still thinking about print. It's a wonderful thing.
You also say ice cream with spinach. We have to give people what they need to know, but we also got to give them a little bit of what they want.
I learned that actually from the late Dan Lynch, who was my predecessor's managing editor of the Times Union many years ago. He was the ice cream and spinach guy. But it is true. We know that spinach is nourishing. We know that we like ice cream, and so you try to give them some of that. Notwithstanding that, it's really hard to give people, well, you think about this, JP, because every day you have to make a selection of what goes at the top of Empire Report. I know a lot of people who start their day by reading Empire Report because it gives them an overview of what's going on in the Empire State. And sometimes you have to give them a boom when there's something really big. That's the sort of signal that this is a big bit of news here. And so you kind of juxtapose drawing people's attention with just what they really kind of need to know, right? That's sort of an art.
Yes, and it's always a struggle, because even running what I would consider kind of a political website, political oriented, a lot of times what I see gets the most clicks are those human interest stories, something interesting that's happening in the Adirondacks, something interesting that's happening in Buffalo, weather, the weather. And it is a tough balance, as all news organizations have, which is what's really important, what should people really know today, and what's really a substantive important issue. But sometimes those important substantive issues, they're not going to get that many clicks. People don't care as much. And so it is a constant decision-making process and a battle in your own mind and amongst your colleagues of What will we put at the top? What will we not even include? And what should we include? In politics, it is, I'm sure you've seen this in your career and you know this, that the personalities and the battle and the back and forth tend to get more interest than the actual policy substance of the state is considering this policy or that policy, which is, while it's more important, is going to be less interesting to the reader.
You know, I'd like to see this poll done today because, you know, things change by the moment, as we've seen over the
That's right.
last 3 weeks.
That's
In
right.
terms of the enthusiasm, at least on the Democratic side, and maybe even caution from Republicans who are wanting to know more and more about Kamala Harris and the new vice presidential nominee. There seems to be some enthusiasm for news on that, at least in my opinion. The other thing is there's this campaign that's going on that we're covering, and now we're hearing criticism, especially on the right and even from some on the left, that Kamala Harris is not doing press conferences.
Right.
What do you guys think about that? Now, she is still the vice president, and it might be in her best interest to do a press conference just to get this now off the table. Should former President Donald Trump be doing press conferences?
Well, of course, they both should be making themselves available to the reporters, but, Trump makes himself available to his friendly reporters, to the right-wing folks on Fox, calls in all the time and rambles. But press conferences have a valid purpose beyond giving information to citizens and to journalists. In a government, a press conference is useful because a president articulates policy and makes decisions about what the policy is, and his statements reflect choices that he's made among often competing demands on different parts of his administration. I keep saying his, and maybe we'll have gender non-specific words every now and then for the president one of these days. But the sense is that you need to have a press conference to clearly allow people to understand where you really stand, even if you try to avoid being pinned down, as politicians always do. I used to be in the side of the notebook. I spent 4 years as a political press secretary in my youth. And we always advised the guy I worked for, answer the question you wish had been asked instead of the one that you got. Say what you want to say. And good reporters will follow up and push back and ask the same question 3 or 4 times. And eventually you'll have the politician say, well, let's move on. Tough stuff. But this survey also from the University of Chicago also has about 38% of the people saying that they actively try to avoid the news, that they are so turned off by the news that they actually turn away from it. And some people say that traditional journalism is in a death spiral at this point because of the impact of the sectionalization, news being targeted to niche audiences, and the effect of all the advertising dollars going to the giant digital sites.
Not to mention AI.
Of course, which is taking it. But now, if it's also the content that is driving people away, you worry, what in the world can I do if my job is to choose?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, is trying to make sure, especially for young readers, hoping to give them something that they might be interested in and be willing to look. Now, that might be photo coverage of a high school sporting event. It might be a style story about, a bunch of fans going to Taylor Swift concerts, or a similar kind of thing at SPAC, and trying to bring them in the door. It's hard to know because our readership certainly skews high. And then when we look at the responses that we get, it's still the age is way up there. That youth readership is missing for us.
We're not their primary source of media. We are not their traditional source of media anymore. And that's the reason, in my opinion, for a lot of the death spiral. But in the meantime, we're all really reaching to be everywhere we can so that no matter what, our content will be king, so that we can bring people in by what we're doing. Now, that's changing for public broadcasting as well.
Well, yes.
And we're seeing we're not immune. Our audience is as old as yours and older. So we're not replacing those as traditional listeners. This is a big problem. And any solution would be welcome. How about, the aggregators pay us?
I also think that would be good. I think Google and Facebook should pay, and I think they're going to in Europe, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think they should certainly do so in America. I also think, though, the issue of young people graduating to become readers is relatively recently, I moved upstate about 7 years ago and have a family, and I never cared about what happened at the Board of Education meeting or what happened with local tax rates and that kind of stuff. And as I grew up and moved into the suburbs and have a family, all of a sudden I'm really interested in those issues, and I'm interested in reading and consuming that content. And I think that I imagine that younger readers have always been a problem for the media to attract.
Yeah, absolutely. You're exactly right. In fact, we counted, that's what I was just saying, we counted on young people to get older, assume responsibilities, whether it be a home or a home and a family or, paying taxes. They need to know these things. And that they would then reach out to public broadcasting because we were providing that information. But these young people don't listen this way anymore. And we aren't replacing them the way we traditionally did.
Yeah, it hasn't quite evolved the way it used to. You see, I think you're a person who would have a tendency to want to look at the news anyway. You're a serious
Yes,
person. You
that's
care
right.
about the issues. And the difficulty is that an increasing percentage of young Americans, as they age into the years when people used to become news consumers, are not. The statistics are just not developing for it. And so you try to lure them, as you say, with something that's a little bit more interesting or more fun. Here's a topic that is emerging as we speak, and we'll see how the national media play it, and that is the attack on Governor Walz's military record, a topic broached by J.D. Vance, saying that, yes, his 24 years in the National Guard, well, fine, but he retired just before his brigade was called up to go into war, and claiming that he exaggerated his rank. Anyway, the question is how much of attention the media will give to that, because that will draw a lot of interest. The same way that the Swift boat attack on John Kerry did. And it is interesting that the Trump campaign has as a key architect the guy who was behind the Swift boat ads, questioning the military record of John Kerry.
So what are you saying, Rex? Are you saying the media would follow a story that gets a lot of ears and eyes because it would drive up their ratings and allow them to charge more for their advertising?
David. But the question would be, I mean, we citizens say, and we want to have substantive discussion of the issues, but in fact, it's that kind of thing that actually draws attention. Otherwise, candidates wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I think the best thing we can do in the media, at least, is to make sure that on our websites and in our paper on this scenario, that we at least run a story that gets into what some of the facts are about, explaining exactly what Walz said and what the ad said and what the response is, and put some context around it. I think the danger that we have is that in the TikTok age and in Instagram, if you just get a clip of the ad that Walz made and then you get a clip of Vance criticizing him, you don't know some of the background. And I think the best media outlets are doing a job where they're talking and explaining exactly what his background was and how it came to be, and trying to put something around that.
Yeah, but when you get down on the local level, like you're talking about, you came up here, you need to know about the local school board and the town meetings and what's happening locally where you live. Maybe they're going to zone it differently, and that's going to make you consider whether you want to live in your community anymore. But we're losing all those journalists. We're losing all of that local news, and that's the other real problem. Judy, your colleague, of course, Miles, for years, talks about this all the time. We're not going to be able to get a lot of that information anymore, and we have something called news deserts now, which is really a more recent phenomenon in my mind.
That is a huge issue. And if you're lucky enough to have local coverage, you typically have one source of that where that reporter, you don't have a choice. On the Walz military service, I think that you could read probably 3 different versions of that story this morning. You could probably read the New York Post version, which will be anti-Walz. You could read the Huffington Post version, which will be pro-Walz. And then I like the Washington Post. I read the Washington Post version, and I knew about this Walz controversy. I was going on the radio. I wanted to educate myself about it. And to do that, for whatever reason, over my lifetime, I have found the Washington Post to be an outlet that gives a balanced assessment of here's what the Democrats say, here's what the Republicans say, and here's what the record is. That's something that I seek out as the truth. I hear you talk about the truth, and that's really what I try and get to. But there's a lot of significantly slanted outlets like HuffPost, like the New York Post, that are giving each of their audiences kind of what they want to hear.
What they want to hear.
Which is why so many people don't trust the news on some level just because of that.
And here's where actually there's such an issue there, David, because that while trust in the media has cratered in recent years, there is an exception. 76% of Americans say they still trust their local news TV station. That is more than the percentage who say they trust their family or friends. They trust their local TV news station. Well, here's the flaw in that. There are now, let me see if I can get the number. The number of stations owned by Sinclair. It is hundreds of TV stations across the country are owned by Sinclair. 294, that is the number. It is the second largest actual network of TV stations, and those local news outlets, including WRGB in New York's capital region, that is called CBS 6. That is a Sinclair station, and these stations are increasingly being told by Sinclair to air these particular stories with this particular right-wing bias. They're being instructed to air controversial right-wing commentaries.
Their main anchor quit as a result of it.
Of Sinclair, yeah.
Yes.
They have their own local evening newscast, yes. And I feel bad for the local journalists there, but it concerns me. And the reason that I bring it up here is because I think people who are in the original broadcast zone here of Northeast Public Radio may not realize that they're getting slanted coverage, sorry to say.
Yeah, I think it's the biggest thing right now is, you advise the public. I advise my kids to be savvy news consumers. And JP brought up something about how the different outlets will sort of have a slightly different version of it. I think what we advise people is saying, don't just take our word for it that we're not fake news. Take a look at our stories, stay with us and read us consistently and find out how we cover the local news. Take a look at the letters, see if we reflect what you know to be accurate in the community, and hopefully we can educate readers and viewers to be good consumers of that. And when it comes to CBS 6, for example, I think if somebody asked me that question about are they all fake news, is it all diluted and polluted by some Sinclair edict, I think what people might want to do is say, Greg Floyd, when he does a story, I know him to be accurate and I can trust him, and to look at that whole newscast with a grain of salt and decide for yourself, is it all totally fair, accurate, or are there some things that are feeds from the national chain that are polluting it? It's a tricky one because we're asking the consumers to make really discerning, educated diagnosis. But I think that's what's required right now.
And that leads us right back to one of Rex's concerns, and that's news literacy. We really do need another course in the primary grades leading up into college. Everyone should be required to take a news media literacy course or even a course in disinformation. I can see them coming to college campuses now as a result of what's happening with AI and the deep fakes and the other things that we're going to be seeing. But this is a real issue. You can't expect people with their busy lives to be experts at everything and to do all these things we may be asking them to do when it comes to information because they don't necessarily understand the intricacies of all that. But one thing we could do is educate them on it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Thanks for bringing that up, David. I think you're so right that we don't teach young people how to discern how to make some of these judgments about what's real and what's not, how to try to determine if the language that they're reading has a color to it, how to go beyond just a single source to get multiple sources, which is really the way to find out what's going on. Or JP, you've learned to trust the Washington Post. I think there's, one of the great things the Post does, they have this great fact check column written by Glenn Kessler, who's a terrific journalist, a veteran journalist who analyzes facts and takes down those who are not telling us the truth. And that's a real useful tool, but it is labor intensive. In our local newsrooms, we can't afford to do a lot of that fact checking, right? I mean, it's part of it is just straightforward news reporting. You fact check everything you do. But that formalized deep dive into determining whether a politician is telling you the truth or not is a really hard thing to do when your staff is as limited as it is now. Yeah, I was just reading, by the way, about the layoffs continuing elsewhere. Axios, a fine national news chain that I read every day. Tampa Bay Times, formerly known as the St. Petersburg Times, traditionally one of America's great metropolitan mid-metro newspapers.
Broadcasting and cable.
Oh, Broadcasting and Cable Magazine is
That's
closing,
huge.
which is an industry publication that's been around forever.
1931, they said, right? It was originally Broadcasting Magazine.
Yeah, quite something. 80 news outlets have cut their staff in 2024. Several have shut down entirely. The Tampa Bay Times is laying off about 20% apparently of their newsroom staff, which I just read was down to about 100 for a paper that was as powerful as the St. Petersburg Times. I was surprised that there were only 100 now, 80 people in their newsroom.
It's terrible news. You know, we have a new CEO coming into WAMC.
Yay, let's hear
and
it.
I'm sure it's great. Everything that I've heard from her so far is wonderful, but you never know, right, guys? I mean, she's reading the tea leaves, too. You know, that's why we got to continue to support programs like the Media Project.
There you go. And let's hear it for the next fund drive. That means this is all the time we have for today. What an interesting media project. We've had Miles Reed, editor of the Daily Gazette of Schenectady, J.P. Miller from Empire Report, our producer, David Gastina. Thank you, David, for putting all this together.
Thank you, Rex. No insight was delivered today.
I'm Rex Smith. We thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll be back again next week as we present to you The Media Project.
Hell just for romance. But finally, the movies notwithstanding, they all got tired of patches on their pants. They organized a union to get a living wage. They joined with
The Media Project is a national production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. This week's projectors include Judy Patrick, Vice President for Editorial Development for the New York Press Association and former editor of the Daily Gazette, and Barbara Lombardo, Adjunct Professor at the University at Albany and former editor of the Saratogian. You can listen to The Media Project anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. I'm your producer, David Gastina. Thanks for listening.
interesting people. Their policy's an acrobatic thing. They claim to represent the common people. It's funny, Wall Street never has complained. Ah, but publishers have worries, for publishers must go to working folks for readers and to big shots for their dough. Now publishers are such interesting people. It could be prostitution, I don't know. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, circulation, ting-a-ling-a-ling, advertising, get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache, what a mess. Oh, publishers are such interesting people. Let's give 3 cheers for freedom of the press.